Welcome to Up and Running with Vue.js. My name is Dan Vega and I will be your instructor for this course. This course isn't meant to teach you everything you need to know about Vue. Instead, I'm taking a little bit of a different approach and creating smaller courses that focus in on a specific topic. This course is meant to give you an introduction and help you get up and running with Vue.js. In this course, we're going to talk about what is Vue. So you might have heard of it, you might have seen it, but what exactly is Vue? More importantly, why would you want to use it? There are so many great frameworks and libraries out there. What kind of makes Vue stand out among the rest? One of the things I really love about Vue is being able to add Vue to existing projects without buying into the entire toolchain. So we're going to look at that, see some examples, and to me, this is one of the real highlights of getting started with Vue. What introduction to a language or framework wouldn't be complete without writing a Hello World application? So we will get in and write our Hello Vue application by using just a plain HTML page, dropping in Vue, and creating a Hello World app. Finally, I'm going to leave you with some resources and kind of next steps, what you should be doing after this course. So the first question is, what are the prerequisites for this course? What should I know when I'm getting into watching this course and trying to go through learning Vue? Well, the only thing you need to know is a little bit of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You don't need to be an expert in all of them, but you should have some working experience with them to start writing Vue applications. So what do I need to take this course? Well, the only thing you need here is a computer and a text editor. So there is a picture of a MacBook. I will be using a MacBook, but you do not need to. You can use Windows. Everything is going to work exactly the same. You're also going to need a text editor. There are plenty of really good text editors out there. My favorite happens to be Visual Studio Code, which is also free, so you can download that for free, and that's really all you need to get up and running in this course. And so finally, I just want to tell you a little bit about me and why I'm teaching this course. So first and foremost, I'm a husband and a father. There's my beautiful family there on the right. I am proud to call Cleveland, Ohio home. I've been a software developer for over 20 years now, so I've seen a lot, I've been through a lot, and I definitely have a lot of experience to kind of share with you. I'm also a curriculum developer at Tech Elevator. Now, I know I'm kind of biased here, but we are one of the best coding boot camps in the country. So if you know someone who wants to learn how to code, definitely point them our way. I'm also the meetup organizer for Vue CLE. So there's a Vue meetup group here in Cleveland, Ohio, which we also run at Tech Elevator. And this is a lot of fun. We have some really great speakers talking on different topics. So if you're ever in the area, check out our meetup calendar and see if we have an event going on. We'd love to have you in and see you in person. Finally, I like to consider myself a maker. I like to make things, whether it's creating courses or videos or articles or documentation or examples for the boot camp. I love to make things, and that's why I feel very fortunate in what I do on my day job and what I do here on the side with creating content like this. So I'm very fortunate to be doing this stuff and very blessed. So I really enjoy working on front-end projects these days, and a lot of that has to do with Vue. I think it's a really awesome framework, and I hope you enjoy this introduction to Vue. With that, let's move on and learn something new today. I don't know about you, but when I want to learn something new, it helps to have a little context for what I'm learning and why I might want to learn it. In this lesson, we're going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what Vue is. So what is Vue? In short, Vue is a JavaScript framework for building mobile, desktop, and web applications. In this course, we will specifically look at adding some functionality to new and existing web applications. But if you wanted to learn Vue and deploy your applications to mobile or the desktop, that is certainly an option. So let's talk a little bit about JavaScript frameworks. You have probably heard of one or maybe even all of these. So there are a lot of frameworks out there, things like Angular and React and Vue and Svelte and Amber and so much more. And the really good thing about these frameworks is a lot of them are learning from each other. They're sharing ideas. They're really doing this to kind of advance the frameworks. And so I don't like to get into these framework wars where this one's better than that one or this one's better than this. I think they're all very good frameworks, and I think that the decision to use a specific framework really comes down to some different factors. Maybe you're at a job and you need to learn a specific one. If you're not and you're just trying to learn a framework, maybe you could look at what in your area is in demand. So if there are just a lot of jobs in your area for something like Angular or React, and your end goal is to get a job, then maybe take a look at one of those. But what I always tell people is don't learn a specific framework just because somebody else told you to. Now, again, if you have to do it for work, that's a different reason. But just because you read somewhere that Angular is the greatest, or Vue is the greatest, or React is the greatest, that really shouldn't drive you to learn one of these frameworks. Spend some time. You don't need to spend a whole lot of time, but maybe take 1 week and spend a few hours on Vue, spend a few hours on React next week, spend a few hours on Angular, and really try to figure out what framework will solve your problems and what framework you really enjoy working in. Because kind of going back to those solving the problems, like most of these frameworks are all going to be able to do the same thing. If anybody tells you like framework A is way better at building web applications than framework B, then they're just kind of lying to you. And they don't know any better. Now, there are certain aspects of that framework that could be better, but as a whole, they all can accomplish a lot of the same things. So it really comes down to where you feel comfortable and what frameworks you enjoy using. As I said at the beginning of this, I really enjoy using Vue. There are a lot of things about Vue I like that we'll touch on, and so that's why I use it. I used to use Angular. I haven't really touched React that much, but I probably should. But again, this is really a personal preference, and I don't buy into these framework wars of this one, you have to use this one because it's better, or this or that. So that's just a little caveat into learning any new language or framework. These all on the screen here are really, really good choices. So who is Vue for? Well, first off, we said this before, but Vue is for anyone who wants to learn a JavaScript framework who has experience in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And those really are the only prerequisites. So if you have those tools under your belt and you want to get started with a JavaScript framework, Vue is really good at that because you don't need to buy into the entire tool chain. You'll hear me say this a lot, but Vue is a progressive framework. And because of that, it allows us to kind of use Vue as our needs grow. So we'll see some more examples of that as we go on. But Vue for me is really great for anybody who is getting into frameworks in general. Maybe this is your first framework or your second framework, but it's really great for beginners because that's all you really need is a good foundation of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now that you know what Vue is, why would you want to use it, and what type of applications can you build with it? So let's take a look at why you would want to use it. So first off, Vue is a progressive framework. I know when you get to the homepage of Vue.js.org, you're going to see this like, hey, Vue is a progressive framework. And at first, it might seem like a lot of marketing jargon, but I promise you it's not. So kind of what this means is you don't have to buy into the entire tool chain and everything that comes with libraries or frameworks to be able to use it. And so right away, we'll look at some examples of this. You can drop a script tag on a page and start going. Now, as your needs start to progress and things become a little bit more complex, maybe dropping a script tag into a web page is not going to fit your needs. Maybe you need an entire tool chain that will get you up and running, create a scaffolded out project for you, give you some type of dependency management, some module bundler. Then as you start to build through that, realize that you need things like routing and state management. So Vue gives you the ability to start from very little, and as your needs and your application start to grow, it will grow with you. And that's kind of what we mean when we keep saying progressive framework. To me, Vue is the most approachable framework. part of the reasons we just discussed, but it's very approachable because all you really need to know is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you jump into something like Angular, you need to learn TypeScript first. Angular kind of forces you to use TypeScript. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I happen to be a big fan of TypeScript, but it's just one more thing that you have to learn. If you're in the React world, you have to learn something called JSX. And so again, nothing wrong with it. It's just something else to learn. For me, Vue's very approachable because of what you need to learn it and the ecosystem that you get with it, the documentation, the community, etc. So another thing about Vue is that it's a very opinionated framework, and some may love this and some may not like it. For me, that really helps beginners get started. So when you're in other frameworks or libraries, there are often many options to do something like routing or state management. In Vue, there are basically one way to do things like, hey, we want you to use the official Vue router, or we want you to use Vuex, which is the official Vue state management system. But there are ways to use others if you want to. But I like that there's that one, like, hey, this is the one that comes packaged with it. This is the one we've tried and tested, and there are many examples on it. But if you want to go off and use another one, you can. So I like the fact that it's opinionated, and it helps. That portion of the framework really helps you get up and running and get over those little bit of hurdles right when you get started. So it's an opinionated framework. Again, I mentioned this before. The documentation is fantastic. The Vue core team has done a really good job with the documentation. Anywhere from just getting started tutorials to APIs, everything. Whether it's the main library Vue or one of the surrounding projects, documentation all around is just really great. There are just some really great features of Vue, more than I can explain right now, but as we start to go into everything, I think this is one of the things that you'll really start to see. Vue has an awesome community, and it's one of those things that I go into looking for. Like, I've been very fortunate to be part of some really great communities in different languages and frameworks, and it's something I like. I like a welcoming group. Like, I don't want to post a question somewhere and be called an idiot. Like, I like to be included. I like that others are always encouraging you. It's just an awesome community. And it's one of those things that I really appreciate about Vue. All right, so what types of applications can we build with Vue? So first, we can start adding interactive content to our existing applications. This could be in a number of languages and frameworks. So I know out of the box, Laravel, a PHP framework, comes packaged with Vue. If you wanted to use something like Spring Boot in Java, there's an easy way to go ahead and drop the Vue script tag onto a page in your templates or your static directory. I've seen a bunch of presentations and a couple at our local meetup group of people using Vue within Microsoft SharePoint. So if you're not a SharePoint developer and you don't want to create these entire SharePoint sites, you could create a Vue portal, I think that's what they call it, and have it connect to your SharePoint data, which is really cool. So I know a lot of people doing that. And really, whatever language or framework you're using, there's probably a use case for it. So just being able to add interactive content to existing applications and not rewrite something from the ground up is really the starting point for me for Vue. Then you have single page applications, also known as SPA. So these are really big these days. For performance reasons, you basically get an application, and when you want to hit another route, it'll actually load it up for you without actually having to move off of that page. So there are a lot of really cool things that you can do with single page applications. There's also a really great framework called Nuxt that if you're in the Vue world, I would recommend checking out once you start to build some bigger applications. So we also have static sites. So static sites, and I'll talk more a little bit about Jamstack in a second, but static sites are kind of getting a big run right now. They're very popular. And mainly with any type of content-based marketing sites, blogs, that kind of stuff, static sites are really great because there's no rendering to do. Like you just have like the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You put it on a server somewhere, and it's really, really fast. And that's what's really fun about it. And in the Vue ecosystem, we have a couple things that can create static sites, one of which was Nuxt I talked about before. But there's something called VuePress, which is really geared towards creating documentation websites. And then there's this Gridsome framework, which I'll talk about in a little bit more in a second. If you want to create mobile applications, there's a really great framework called NativeScript, which allows you to, as it sounds, create native applications using Vue. So that's something you can check out. And finally, desktop applications. So if you wanted to use something like Electron, you can write desktop applications in Vue. Now again, we're going to focus more on the website, but I just wanted to point it out that these are possibilities. So I mentioned static site before, and you might hear the term Jamstack thrown around a lot. And Jamstack really just stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And this is a really big rage these days because, like I said, people are moving off of these complex server-based solutions when they don't need them. So for me personally, I had a blog that was in WordPress, and I'm not a PHP developer. I really love WordPress as a platform and as a blogging platform. It was great. But trying to design themes and plugins when you're not a PHP developer isn't a lot of fun. And that's why I moved my website over to a static site this year. And again, Jamstack is all about just trying to keep things simple. Maybe not static in the sense of like it has no dynamic functionality, because they can absolutely have dynamic content. But the idea there is to create these really, really fast kind of websites. And so that's what I mentioned before. One thing I did this year was I moved my WordPress site off of WordPress and over to a static website using a framework called Gridsome within the Vue community. So Gridsome is free. It's an open source project. They do a really great job with it. I definitely recommend checking it out. But like I said, I've created this website. It's a static website. It's super fast. It's really just a blog and has information about my courses and newsletters and that kind of stuff. And so I'm like really, really happy with it because it's gotten me back to like being able to just write front end code. Like I have layouts and pages, and like I don't have to worry about some weird WordPress theme or plugin or whatnot. So that's just a little bit of a plug, a little bit of an example of something that you can build within Vue. So I hope that helped. That was a little bit on why I think Vue is so great, some applications that you can build in Vue. And in the next lesson, we'll take a look at moving from jQuery to Vue. For anyone who hasn't worked with one of these larger JavaScript frameworks, they can be pretty confusing and intimidating. There are entire toolchains that handle dependency management, transpiling, module bundling, build steps, and so much more. But what happens when you don't want to buy into that whole process? And I just want to add some interactive content to an existing application. I mentioned earlier that Vue is a progressive framework, and this means that we can just drop this into a page or onto an existing project without all of that complexity. As our needs grow, Vue will grow with us. This really reminds me a lot about a time where I fell in love with JavaScript, and that was when I started using jQuery. With jQuery, I could just drop a script onto a page, use some simple, readable syntax, and I could do some common things that I needed to get done. Did you know that you can just drop Vue into a web page the same way that you did with jQuery? In this lesson, I want to take a look at some of the examples of what I would use jQuery for, and then replace them with Vue. But before I get started, I wanted to mention two really great articles here. One is by Sarah Drasner on Smashing Magazine, replacing jQuery with Vue.js, no build step necessary. It's a really good article that goes into a lot of the concepts I'm talking here and so much more. And then another one by Ray Camden, Making the Move from jQuery to Vue. If this is something you're looking to do, moving from jQuery to Vue, those are two really well-written articles that I would go ahead and check out. So what are some of the things I would use jQuery for in the past? One is, hey, when the DOM's ready, let me know so I can go ahead and run some code. Now, we know that these days, if we're using plain old JavaScript, we can do that with DOM content loaded event, but this is something I would often use jQuery for back in the day. How about finding stuff in the DOM? Maybe you wanted to find single elements or a bunch of elements. jQuery made this very easy to do when it wasn't easy to do in the browser. Now we do have some methods, APIs in the browser that help us do this, but this was very hard at one point. Hiding and showing things. Maybe I wanted to click on a button and hide something, or click on a button and show something. This was something I often used jQuery for. Adding classes to elements. Hey, if I want you to click on a button and highlight all the words bacon, we could do that pretty easily in jQuery by just adding some classes to some different elements. One of the big things I've used jQuery for is capturing user input. I need to go ahead and get some input from the user, whether it be a form submission or just anything on the page. I want to capture that and then maybe do something with that. And one of those things I used to do a lot was submit a form. And finally, there were jQuery plugins for almost everything. Some of them were great. A lot of them were very hard to use as far as just configuring them and really kind of extending them. But the jQuery plugin ecosystem was really amazing. So now I want to do is just take a look at a couple of simple things that we talked about there. We'll look at how we would have done that in jQuery and how we might do that in Vue. Now, I don't pretend that you'll know everything that we're doing on the Vue side, but the point of this is to just kind of show what's possible right out of the box, okay? So in this example, we are looking at a script tag. You'll see we've dropped in the current version of jQuery. And on the page, we use that $, which is you often see in jQuery applications. It's referring to jQuery and it says, hey, when the document is ready, I want you to go ahead and run this function. All we do is log out count to the console that the DOM is ready. And so again, that is something I do often. And then, inside that function, I do whatever I needed to get done. We can do something something similar in our Vue applications. We have these things called lifecycle hooks, which are really a way to hook into the lifecycle of a component. So in this case, we're just saying, hey, when this component is mounted, which means it's available in the DOM, I want you to go ahead and do something. So we can do that kind of stuff. Here in jQuery, we are looking for something and we are attaching a click event listener to it. So inside of our ID of app, there is a paragraph tag that has the text hello jQuery. And so again, we use our document.ready function and we go in and we look for a paragraph, and when it's clicked, we log it out. So we can do something very similar here on the Vue side, except we're not binding ourselves to the DOM the way that jQuery was. So in jQuery, you very much rely on the way the DOM was built, and if that changed, then the application would no longer work. Here what we're saying is, hey, when somebody clicks on this p tag, so that's always going to be there as long as that p tag is there, because we have an on-click event listener there, saying, hey, when this is clicked, I want you to go ahead and call this method called onClick. And when that happens, that function executes and we just log something to the console. Similarly, in jQuery, if we wanted to find multiple elements, we could do so. Again, we can do the same kind of thing here in Vue. During that click event, by default, the original DOM event is passed along, so you can do things like get the current target and the inner text or HTML. and find out what was clicked. Here we have some text. We have a button, and what I'm saying in jQuery here is, hey, when this button is clicked, I want you to go ahead and toggle that button or toggle that text. And so we can do something very similar in Vue, and we do it a little bit different. So on the first p tag, we have what's known as a directive, and that directive is called a vShow, and this determines whether or not this paragraph tag should be shown or not. And this vShow is relying on this variable called showText, and by default that showText is true. But then on the button we have a click event handler, and we have an inline function basically. So we're evaluating whatever is going on inside of here, and we're setting showText to whatever the opposite of showText is. So by default it's true. When we click on it, it will be false, and that paragraph above will be hidden. So that's something else we can do in Vue. So enough like little examples. I want to go into like a little bit better of an example, and we're calling this the user input demo. And all of the code that I've shown previously, and including this one, will be on my GitHub at /danvega, and then the repository is up and running with Vue.js. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into a demo. All right, so in the repository up and running with Vue.js that I just pointed you to, you should find a start folder with a couple of templates that have some starter code, and the rest we're going to kind of fill in together. So here I have just a basic page that I've dropped the jQuery script tag on. So I just grabbed the latest from the jQuery website. And here I have this app. So I have div ID app, I have a label, I have an input, and I have a paragraph tag with a class of greeting. Now what we want to do here is, as someone types into the input, we want to go ahead and grab what they're typing and display a greeting. So in our case, I'd say hello Dan if I typed out Dan. But every time that they type in a character, we'd kind of capture that input. So now the way that we do that here in jQuery is, the first thing I would do is actually get a reference to that greeting. So I'd say const greeting is equal to, then we'll say jQuery, and I'll say, hey, go find the class greeting and give that back to me. So once I have that, I'm going to use jQuery to then go ahead and look at the name input. And I'm going to say every time you key up, so every time you press a key, I want you to go ahead and run this function. And this function is going to do a couple of things. The first thing that it's going to do is we need to get the name. So whatever they're typing into that input, I need to capture that. So the way that I'm going to do that is by using this as a special keyword. It's basically the context of what's getting passed into this function. So in this case, it's going to be the input. So I'm going to say, hey, that input, I want to get the val of that, the value, and that'll be the name. And then what I want to do is I want to go ahead and empty whatever's in greeting. So I need to empty that out. Again, that's another something that jQuery is giving to us. And then I want you to go ahead and I want you to append something in there. And so what we're going to append into that greeting is hello, and then whatever that name is. So we'll say name. Okay, so I'm going to save that. I'm running this with something called live server. So if you're in VS Code, there's an extension called live server. You can just say open with live server and it should work. So now if I go into here and I start typing Dan, then it's going to print out hello Dan. And again, anytime we key up, that's going to change, and it just works pretty well. Now that is the jQuery version. So now what I want to do is kind of look at the Vue version. So get a good mental model of what we did here, and let's move on. So here in Vue, we have kind of the same markup, right? We have the name, we have the input, and then we have this paragraph tag, and we'll take that directive off for now just to kind of show how this works. So when we get into the next lesson, we'll talk through this a little bit more about what this Vue instance is. But the main thing to kind of get from this is that we've said, hey, no matter what else is going on this page, I want you to basically use Vue within this element. So EL stands for element, and we're passing it a # app or hashtag app, however you want to say it. But that's basically saying, give me the ID of an app. And that's where we want to use Vue. And one of the things we can do is we can have some data in here. And I'm going to set something called name equal to an empty string. So now in Vue, we have this other directive called vModel, and we can tie it to a property. So I'm tying it to something called name, which right now is an empty string. So that's that. So now as we start to type in the input box, Vue is going to basically update that property for us. Everything is reactive now. As we're typing in that input box, that data property is getting updated. So now what we can do is come down here and let's do another directive. So we can say vShow, which you just saw in that toggle demo. But basically this is a directive to determine whether or not this element should be shown. So what we want to say is, as long as name is not equal to blank, go ahead and show this. And what I want you to do output here is hello, comma, and then we use this curly bracket syntax, this double curly bracket, some often referred to as a mustache template. And that is going to tell us to output a variable or property called name. So now with that all kind of put together, we can go ahead and open this with Live Server as well. And as we type in here, it does the same thing. But for me, there's a really big advantage here. One is we're using Vue, which is going to basically create that reactive property and update that property for us. And there has been a lot of work that goes into Vue to figure out the best way to render a property. Like, does the DOM need to be updated? Whereas in something like jQuery is just always updating the DOM. And then again, back to the DOM, jQuery is very tied into the DOM, right? Like if anything here changes, we're going to be in trouble. So I just really like Vue for even the simplest of things like this. Obviously, when you get into like forms and submissions and displaying data, it can be pretty complex, but we all start somewhere, right? We all start with a basic example like this. So that's all I wanted to show you. These finished examples are also in the repository. But with that, now that we've kind of seen what Vue looks like, we are going to write some Vue together in the next lesson, and we'll do it right after this. With me long enough. It's time to put some of this knowledge to use. And in this lesson, we are going to build our Hello Vue, our Hello World application, and we'll do it together. All right, so the first thing you're going to need is Visual Studio Code, or as I said before, any text editor will do. Whatever you're comfortable using is fine. We're just going to be using a plain HTML file and a little bit of JavaScript. So any text editor will work. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. If you want to, you can go ahead and pause this, download it for whatever operating system you're on. Maybe just spend a few minutes getting used to it if you've never used it before. After you've done that, we're going to move over to the main Vue website, which is Vue.js.org. And we're going to click on this Getting Started button. So this is a really great place to get started with Vue. Again, I said earlier, the documentation is really good. This kind of step-by-step is really the next step after this course, is to dive into this and start going through everything. But what we want to do here is we want to grab the script tag that we're going to include on our web page. So as you can see here, there's a development version and a production version. I'm going to grab the development version. What this does is just include some helpful counsel warnings if you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing in Vue. If you were going to put this in production somewhere, you can switch over to this tag. So what we're going to do is jump over to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to say this is index.html. And in Visual Studio Code, you can use, there's some really like helpers to kind of help you kickstart different templates. And so if I type out HTML and hit HTML5, I can come in here and get a template up and running. So right underneath that title tag, I'm going to paste in that script tag, and we now have Vue on our web page. Now, we haven't really done anything with it yet, but hey, we're ready to go. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an app, div element with the ID of app. So in Visual Studio Code, you can use something called Emmet, the kind of shortcuts that gives you like this nice way of creating elements. So I created this div with an ID of app, and inside of here, we want to display our welcome message. So it might look like hello Vue, but we don't want to display it there. We want to do this dynamically through Vue. So down here, I'm going to put a new script tag, and you've already seen this syntax because we've seen it a lot in the previous lesson where we went through from jQuery to Vue, and even in the lesson where we did it together. But we didn't actually get to talk about what we were doing there. So here in a script tag, what we're going to do now that we have Vue on our page, we're going to use the new keyword, and we're going to create a new instance of Vue. Now this new Vue instance takes some options in here. So these are some different things. And again, go back to the documentation, look at the API, and see what our different options are. One of our options is EL, which stands for element. And again, I said Vue doesn't take up your entire page the way something like jQuery would. Vue needs somewhere to basically work within. So here we're going to say that, hey, I want you to use Vue on our element that has an ID of app. And to do so, we'll just say app. Next, we're going to create a data property here, and this is going to be an object. And inside of here, we are going to use a new property called message. And here's where we will type out our welcome message, which is hello Vue. So now with that saved, now anything inside of that data object is going to be reactive, which is really cool. We'll see an example of that in a second. But now what I want to do is go ahead and output whatever's in that message property in our page. Now, again, we can't do that up here. We can't come in here and say message because that's not within the context of that app ID. And that's where we told our page here that Vue was going to live. So inside of here, we can create a paragraph, or even let's do an H1, and we'll change that, and we'll say, all right, I want you to go ahead and display whatever's in the property message. So just like we did before in Visual Studio Code, if you have that live server extension, you can say open with live server, and it's going to open it up, and there is our hello Vue. Now, nothing terribly exciting to do, but that is your first look at Vue starting from scratch. Now, one thing I want to do, so here we have this new Vue instance, but we haven't assigned it to anything. So I'm going to say const VM is equal to new Vue. And you'll see VM referred to a lot. It's not, this is not a requirement. You don't need to call it VM. Vue is actually modeled after the Vue model pattern. So that's why you often see that VM when in the assignment of a new Vue instance. All right, so I'm going to open up the DevTools here in Chrome. I'm going to go over to console. And now that we've assigned our Vue instance to a variable called VM, we can come here in the console and we could say, hey, VM, go ahead and change the property called message. We're going to go ahead and change that variable into something else. So let's say another message. And as soon as I hit enter, you see that it changes on the page. And that's because Vue the data within, or the properties within that data object are reactive. Anything we declare there is reactive. So Vue is now watching those properties and saying, all right, when those update, I need to go ahead and update the DOM, which it just did. So now if you've ever done something like this manually in vanilla JavaScript, you know that this can be quite cumbersome. Now this is a simple example, but as this starts to grow, that becomes very complex. So that's just a really quick example of how to get up and running with Vue by just dropping a script tag on a web page and really creating a new Vue instance. We set a data property there called message to hello Vue, and we also looked at assigning that Vue instance to a variable and then using that variable to kind of change the data as the page is running. So that's our hello world example. I hope you found this useful. You can find the finished version of this on the repository up and running with Vue.js, and I will see you in the next lesson. All right, welcome to this section, Vue Core Concepts, where we are going to learn about the different building blocks in Vue through a series of tutorials and exercises. I wanted to let you know that all the source code for all the examples that we're going to go through in this section are here on GitHub at this particular repository. And it's broken down by lesson with starting code and a finished solution. So if you head over to github.com/danvega/up and running with Vue.js, you will see a structure that looks like this. There's still some more to do in this course, so it may look a little different, but it should look pretty similar. So when we start talking about lists, you would go into the list folder, and when I talk about the basic loop, you can go in and use the starting HTML so that you don't have to write all this boilerplate out, and follow along with me as we start to build out that example. And when you're done, if yours doesn't look exactly like mine, there's always a finished solution so that you can kind of compare what you've written to what I have and just see it working. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. All the code for this course is up here at this repository. And if something is missing, please let me know. But with that, let's move on and start writing some code together. In the previous lesson, you learned how to write your first Hello World application in Vue. In this lesson, I want to build on that and talk about a core concept in Vue called data binding. You saw an example of this in the Hello World application, but we didn't really get a chance to talk about it. So here we are over on the Vue.js.org website. If you click on the Getting Started, we've seen this documentation before, but I just want to point out to you where we're going to be kind of talking about in the documentation. So if you get on a template syntax, this is going to talk about how to use expressions and use directives, and this is what we're going to cover in this video. So what I want to do, the easiest way to do this is to just jump into some code and take a look at a few things. So if you look under data binding, the first thing we're going to talk about is expressions. So if you go ahead and open up your start.html, we can go ahead and work through a few examples here. So we've already seen this in the Hello World example, but if we ever want to display data, so data is in our data object here, if we want to display that data on our page, we can easily do so using an expression within the double curly brackets, or what's known as the mustache syntax. So we can come in here, we can say, actually, let's go ahead and wrap this in a P, and we can say, let's just do message is equal to message. So now anything inside of the double curly brackets is known as an expression. In this case, we're just outputting whatever the variable message inside, or whatever the property message inside of that data object it represents. So if we go ahead and run this in live server, so open up with live server, we can see that that is hello Vue. And we know, because we did this in the Hello World example, that this is reactive. It's a reactive property. So Vue is going to be constantly looking at that message property to see if anything changes. So if we come in here and we say Vue message is hello Dan, and we go ahead and update that, it will update in the DOM. So that's that. That's one way that we can kind of output something. That's an expression, right? So we can do other things with expressions. So let's go ahead and say we have this count down here. So this count is initialized to the value of 10. So what if we said count plus 1? Oops. So this is just my label. So now inside of the double curly brackets, again, any expression is valid. So in our case, we could just output count, but we can also perform some operation on it. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and add 1 to the count. And if I go ahead and save this, you can come over here, we can see that it's 11. And again, anytime that count is updated, so if I say count is equal to 120, you'll see that that expression is now updated because it knows that count is changed, and because it's reactive there, it'll go ahead and update that value that was outputted inside of those double curly brackets. So let's just look at a few more. So again, we can do the same kind of thing with let's say 2. We could do any type of expressions in here. So if we wanted to do 2 times 100, we don't need to actually use a variable. Any kind of expression can be used in here. So we can say 2 times 100. And if we save that, that evaluates to 200. All right, how about a new one? Let's say that we have a greeting here. So we have this variable called greeting. So let's say greeting, and then what we want to do is we want to do some string concatenation. So here we're going to say, I'm going to take whatever value is in that greeting variable, and I want you to go ahead and add this view to it. So that is, because this is a variable, this is our property, we can go ahead and just output the value of that, and then what we're doing is we're adding a string value to that already existing value. So if we go back to our page, it should say hello view. So again, I hope you're starting to see that inside of these double curly brackets, we can do a lot of different things. It's not just to output a particular value. So next, what I want to do is we can do something kind of fun here. So let's say we want to take the reverse of whatever our message is. So we're going to have these double curly brackets, and we're going to do something here. We're going to take our message, which is hello view right now. What we're going to do is we're going to split it. So we're using just a JavaScript method called split. And what we're going to do is reverse that. So we're going to reverse all of the characters in that particular string and then just join them back. And so what this should do is, as you can see there, it just reversed all of the characters in that string. Okay, so let's take a look at another example. So let's say that we wanted to find out if our product was in stock. So we have this in stock variable inside of our product object, and right now it's true. So we could output that as is, but true isn't really a great way to tell someone that this product is in stock. So a better way would be to say like yes or no. So what we can do is come in here and we can evaluate that particular variable. So let's just say product.instock. And what we can say is, all right, if it is in stock, I want you to display yes. If it is not in stock, I want you to display no. And the way we could do that here is by using the ternary operator in JavaScript. So the first expression is, all right, if it is equal to true, here's what I want you to display. Else, I want you to display this. So if we go ahead and save that, we can see that it is in stock. And of course, if we were to say in stock is equal to false, that would go ahead and update. So let's look at one more. So one more thing that we haven't seen yet is we have this way to define data inside of our Vue instance. We also have this methods block. You'll start to see this more as we start to build out some examples, but methods give us a way to define our own methods. So here I have a method called getNewMessage, and it's just going to return a string. but we can go ahead and call that method within our double curly brackets. So let's just say new message, and inside the double curly brackets, we're just going to say get new message because it's available here in our template. And I'm going to go ahead and save that, and you can see that here. So this was just a quick example of using expressions. It's much more than being able to just output a simple data property within your template. You can do a whole bunch of really good things with this. Now, we're going to start to see some limitations when we want to do certain things, and that's where directives will come in, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at that now. All right, so let's go ahead and close the expressions example, and we'll go into data binding and directives. And let's go ahead and use the start example. So I mentioned that we'd start to see some limitations, and I want to take a look at an example of where an expression won't work and where directives really come into play. So as you can see, I have this link object here. So this is representing a hyperlink. So we want to dynamically add this link to our page. It has things like what text to display, where to actually send the user to, an alt value, and maybe a class that we can apply to that link. So if knowing how we can output those types of data properties, if we try to do that with a link, we'll run into an issue here, but let's give it a try. So I'm going to drop an A tag here, and I'm going to say href. And inside of here, I can definitely output the link.text. So if I go link.text, that's going to work just fine. But how do I get the href value in here? If we were to go ahead and try this, link.href, and go ahead and save that. Let's go ahead and try and run this with live server. And as you can see here, we're going to get an error. So we have interpolation inside attributes has been removed. Use vbind or the colon shorthand instead. For example, here's an example of how to do that. So what this is telling us is basically what we're trying to do is not allowed, which is no big deal. There is a way to do it. You just can't do it this way. So let's hop back over to the documentation, and I want to take a look at the API. And if we go down, you'll see a section on directives. So these are different directives that we can use in our HTML elements or any of our elements. And what this does is allows us to do certain things with properties. And we'll see a bunch of different directives, but one of the big ones is vbind. So you'll see all of the directives in Vue start with v dash. So if we look down at vbind, you'll see some information about it, but basically it allows us to dynamically bind one or more attributes or a component prop to an expression. And you'll see some examples here. So here is the image tag. If we wanted to dynamically insert an image source, we can use the vbind source and then a variable called image source. There's also a shorthand, which you're going to see a lot of, which I'm actually going to use. We'll use the long form and then the shorthand, but you'll see that just the colon and source is really the same as vbind colon and then source. So vbind is just saying, hey, I want you to dynamically bind some data, and then anything after the colon is the attribute that you're binding to. So let's take a look at that with our link. So if we go ahead and pull this out, what we can do is we can say, all right, I want you to vbind colon, and then the attribute that we're going to bind to is the href one. So now what we can do is in here, we can just say link.href, because this is no longer being interpreted as just plain text. It's actually looking for a value, a property called link.href. Now, if you wanted to, you could combine data properties and strings and do some like concatenation, and we will see an example of that later in this course. But for right now, we're just going to do that. So let's go ahead and save that. come back up here and no errors so far in the console. And as you can see, we get the href that we expect and then the text inside of there. So far, so good. So what I'm going to do is actually use the shorthand for the alt. So if it's just v-bind colon alt to get the alt tag, I'm just going to use colon alt, and I can say link.alt. And we can also do the same for class and say link.class. So again, there is a link object with a few properties in there: text, href, alt, and class. And I'm just using those to build out this link. So if we come back here, we see our href, we see our alt value, and we see our class. So pretty cool. So data binding from a directive standpoint is very easy. Again, it's just using this vbind directive. There are many directives, so I would suggest going into the documentation and really taking a look at what's there, but you'll start to see these as we build this out. So another directive in there, if you look through the documentation, is vif. And vif allows us, there's two for kind of using conditional controls. There's vf and vshow. And so the first one is, let's say we had this paragraph and we wanted to display, this is a special sales banner. But we didn't want to always display this. We only wanted to display this if our property here is true. So what we can do is we can come in here and say v if, and then again, that's the directive. And then the directive is saying, all right, I'm going to evaluate whatever you have inside of these quotation marks here. So I'm going to say, all right, I want to evaluate if show banner is equal to true or not. So all you can do is just say if show banner. I mean, this is the same as saying equal to true. So if show banner, go ahead and show this. So if we hop over back to our page, you don't see it. If we were to go ahead and, do we have a VM? Yep. If we were to go ahead and update this, so show banner is equal to true, you'll now see that sales banner. So again, I mentioned the other one is a vshow. So what if we had secret number, and inside of secret number, we had a span, and inside that span, we were showing our secret number property. So our secret number right now is 0. So we can have, say, a conditional on here. So vshow is equal to, and we can say if the secret number is not equal to 0. So if it's not equal to 0, I want you to go ahead and display that. So it's not showing here. And actually, we could move that to the P, but that's okay. So now what I can do is come in here and say, all right, vm.secret number is equal to 90 or 88. And so now when that updates and it's no longer 0, vshow says, okay, your secret number is no longer 0. I'm going to go ahead and display that. And so the real difference here between vf and vshow, you'd use vf if it's something that you know you're not going to be evaluating over and over again. So in my case, I'm not going to like change my mind and display the sales banner. It's either being shown or it's not shown. And so there's a big difference here. If we look at this and we look at our P here, so this is being shown. Let's go ahead and just refresh this so it's not shown. You'll see the difference here is this is display none. So it's still being added to the DOM. It's just adding a style to go ahead and hide it for now. If you look in here, we can't see that other one anywhere, and that's because this doesn't even get added to the DOM. So VF doesn't get added to the DOM. vshow will just kind of toggle the style, whether it's to be displayed or not. So that's a little bit of the difference there. So one other directive I want to look at is vhtml. So let's say that I have an article, and inside of this article, I want to display my blog post. So I'm going to display my post, which is right here. And you'll notice inside that post that it contains some HTML. It just contains strong around the word awesome. So we head back over here, you're going to see that it's actually writing out the HTML tags as text. And we don't want that. We want them to be interpreted as HTML and actually display the word awesome in strong. So the way that we do that is we go ahead and go into article and we use the directive vhtml. And now, so vhtml is going to look for something, look for an expression here. And we're just going to add post. So it's not the word post. It's actually looking for a property called post. And now you can see that's actually interpreted as HTML and displays awesome with a little bit of bolded text. So that is a little bit about directives. Again, you're going to come into some caveats when you start working with expressions. Things like being able to data bind data to different attributes of elements. And that's where the vbind directive really comes in. There's vf and vshow for conditionally rendering things, vhtml, and there are some more. So as I said, go ahead and take some time and look through the documentation. These directives really come in handy. And as you start to go on your Vue journey a little bit more, you'll see there's a lot of custom directives out there that do some really cool, fancy things. So that's a little bit about data binding. It's an important concept in Vue, and it's one that you really need to hammer home before moving on. So if you get a chance, spend some time just playing around with this and understanding how you can take data and express it through whether it's expressions or directives. So with that, we will go ahead and move on. One of the first things that you might want to do is display a list of things on a page. In Vue, we can do this pretty easily thanks to something called the v-for directive. Now that you know what directives are, this should make a little bit more sense, but let's head over to the documentation and just take a look at what v-for can do for us. So here we are on the Vue.js website. We're going to go over to Learn and API. And again, we're going to head down to directives. So under directives, you're going to see a v-for. And so v-for expects an array, an object, number, string, or iterable. And you can see the usage here that it renders the element or template block multiple times based on the source data. Now the source data is one of those expects. The directive's value must use the special syntax alias in expression. So alias being whatever we want to refer to each of the items in the list, array, etc., and provide the current element being iterated on. So you see an example here, div v-for item in items, and then that item is what has the different properties on it. So there may be a text property on the item, and that's what we want to display. And if we had a list of 100 things, it would loop over that 100 times. So that's the basic syntax. There are a lot of different nuances to this. So let's take a look at a few. And the easiest way to do this is to jump into some examples. So I'm going to go over here in the code for this particular course and go into the list folder. And we're going to start with a basic loop. And let's go ahead and go into start. So the first thing that we need to do, we should kind of get used to doing this. We need to tell Vue where we're going to be working. So we say new Vue, and in the options, I'm going to pass the element of app. So that sets us up to use this div here as our Vue instance. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create an unordered list. And what I want to do is I want to loop over 10 times and display basically 10 list items. So I always want to loop on the item that I want to display multiple times. So I wouldn't loop here because that would display the unordered list 10 times. I want to loop on the list element and display this 10 times. So we're going to say v-for, And now we don't have any lists or arrays or objects or anything to work with. What we can do is actually just loop over a static number here if we wanted to. So this is our first example. I'm going to say I want to loop over for num. So num is our alias, and that's how we're going to reference each iteration. And now I need to provide something here. I could provide an array, so I could do something like 1, 2, 3, or I can actually just provide a number. And this number says, all right, I want you to go through 10 times. So now in the list item, what I can do is I can reference the alias. So the alias in this case is num. So what happens is we're going to loop over this 10 times and create 10 different list items. And then for each one, it's going to give us the number. So the first time it'll be 1, the second time it'll be 2, and so on. So let's go ahead and open this with live server. And as you can see, we get our 10 items. And if we were to look at the source, you can see we have 1 unordered list and then 10 list items. And we could probably clean this up just a little by going like this. So that cleans that up. Cool. So that's just our first example of really easily looping over something 10 times. Again, you can use anything you want here that the v-for directive expects. So an array, an object, a number. In this case, we used a number. So let's take a look at another example. So we're going to look at an example called basic friends, and let's go ahead and open up the start. So here I have a little bit more of a complex example. In the data function here that returns an object, inside of that object, I have a property called friends, which is of type array. And inside that array, I have 10 objects. Each of these objects has a name and a username. And if you're not familiar with them, these are actually Twitter followers that I think you should go out and follow if you're getting into Vue. So Evan Yu is the creator of Vue. That's his username on Twitter. So we have these 10 users that I want to display on a page. So how can we do that? So same thing, let's go ahead and start with a UL. And the list item is what I want to iterate over. So I'm going to say the same thing. v-for is our directive. So we need an alias. So I'm going to start with friend. So friend in, and then the property name is friends. So I'm going to say friends. And inside of friends, I want to display some things, right? I want to display the name and the username. So to do that, this alias is going to give us this entire object. And then as we iterate, it'll give us this one, then this one, then this one. So the way that we get the name is we just say friend.name. And we'll say, whoops, friend.username. Whoops. And then that should be enough to go ahead and output this. And we may see an issue. Let's just come back here and open with live server. And there we go. So we get all the friends outputted with their name and then their username. So we go ahead and open this in the console. We don't actually get an error, but we will later on. So one thing I want to mention is that whenever you're using v-for to iterate over some type of collection here, one thing that we need to add is a key. And a key is the way that Vue basically keeps track of each individual item and knows when it needs to update a specific item or not. And this is just due to the reactivity system. It doesn't want to have to go through and update the entire list. It only wants to update items that have changed. So to do so, it uses something called a key to keep track of each row, basically. So we already saw this before, but there's a vBind attribute for key. So key looks like that. And again, we can use the shorthand to just say key. And so what you need is something that's going to be unique in each row. In our case, the username is going to be unique because you can't have two people on Twitter with the same username. So we can use username here, but if you were using, say, a database a collection of rows in a database, they might have an ID or a unique identifier. Those are the types of things that you need to use for the key. So in this case, I'm going to say friend.username is going to be our key. So nothing changes there. I don't know why it keeps reformatting that when I change it, but it is what it is. So that is a way to basically output that information. But now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking that, well, it doesn't really lend well to an unordered list, right? This seems like we have some tabular data and it might make more sense in a table. So let's look at how we could use a table to output this. So we're going to go into table friends and go to start. And same thing here. We have some basic styles for our table. We have the same data, and I want to take a look at how we could loop over this to add our information to a table. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a table. And inside the table, we're going to create a T head. We're going to create a row. And then inside here, we're going to create some column headings. So we're going to say name. We're going to say username. And we're going to say link. So I want to link out to Twitter and actually provide you a link to go find that particular Twitter user. So that's it for the head. We're going to do something in T-body now. We're going to create a row. And now this row is the thing that we want to iterate over every time, right? Like we don't want to create 10 T-bodies. We just want to create 10 rows. And inside of those rows is where all of the information about our user is going to be. So we start off again with the v4 directive, and we're going to give it an alias of friend in, and friends is the array here. So we're going to say friend in friends. Again, we need a key, so we're going to say friend.username. And so inside of here is where we will do display each of the friends. So the first time I need to display the name because that's the first column. So I'm going to say friend.name. Then we'll say friend.username. And finally, we need to display the link. So we don't have a link here. So how could we display a link? So let's start with the fact that we'll probably need a link. So we need an A tag here with an href, and inside of here, we want to display something. So I might want to display like their Twitter handler. So this would be like friend.username again with just the @ symbol because that's what it looks like on Twitter. I don't know why I keep saving that. And now what we need to do is we need to display a link to Twitter. And so how can we do this? So we talked about this in a previous lesson where if you need to display some dynamic data in an attribute, this is where we need to use the vbind directive. So I'm going to actually use the vbind href here. And I need to do some concatenation in here, right? Because I know that it's going to be at https://twitter.com/ and then the username. But I also know I can't do this. And I know that anything inside of here right now is an expression that's being evaluated. So I need to tell the expression that this is an actual literal string. And the way I can do that is I can just put this in single quotes. And now we can say, I want you to go ahead and concatenate the friend.username. So that should give us what we want. Let's go ahead and run this in live server and see if it works. Awesome. So we have the name, we have the username, and then we have a link. Let's see if that will go there. And it does. So there's Evan Yu. Cool. So that is working pretty much how we want it to work. But I do see another problem here. What if I wanted to display maybe the row number? Like I wanted to have an index here so that I can have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I know what kind of row that we're on. So in this current setup, there's actually no way to do that. But let's jump over to table friends with index and start, and let's take a look at this. So we just ended up with, we're starting with what we just ended up with in that last example, but we want to be able to display an ID. So let's say that we had another column heading here called ID, and down here we want to display the number. So what number are we on? What is the like iteration that we're in? If we're looping over something and we do it 10 times, we should be able to keep track of what number of the iteration that we're on, right? And there actually is a way to do this. So here, we're going to surround this with brackets. And in this bracket, it's going to ask for the alias, and then the second argument here is the index. So if you just say index, you can name this whatever. You can name it ID, num, whatever. But now what it's going to do is it's actually going to give us an alias here and an index. So now we can just refer to this as index. And if we save that and open that with Live Server, you'll see that we have 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9. And again, that's because indexes are 0 based. So if we just wanted to make this a little bit more friendly for our visitors, we could just say index plus 1, and now we get our indexes starting with 1 to 10. So that is something that you will come across. There'll be often times where you need to know what index you're on, and that's a helpful way of getting the index. So I hope this was helpful. Again, a lot of what you'll do in Vue is I find myself a lot of times having to iterate over a list of things and display those lists of things on a page. It could be all of the things, it could be a paginated row of things, but I often find myself doing this. So understanding all the nuances of being able to display data in lists or arrays or objects or numbers or whatever is very helpful. So again, always refer back to the documentation, but I hope the v4 directive you found helpful. And again, you're going to be using it a lot, so get familiar with it. With that, let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson. In this tutorial, you will be creating a counter application. We already saw an example of methods earlier, but in this example, you're going to actually create your own. And with methods in place, it's really easy, and you'll be ready to learn another core concept in Vue, which is event handling. In fact, the ability to respond to user interaction or any type of events is a fundamental concept of any web application. So here we are in the code for this course, and I'm going to go into the counter folder, and we're going to go ahead and open up the start file, so start.html. And we're just going to walk through this application together. So just as we have done before, we're going to go ahead and create a new Vue instance, which is going to take in some parameters here, or some options. And so again, we're going to use the ID of app as our root element, and we're going to have some data in here, and data is going to return a function. And inside of there, we're going to set a count, and we're going to create a count, and we'll initialize it to 0. And we're going to go ahead and create a div, and we'll just go ahead and output the count. And if we go ahead and run this, we can see that our count is 0. So nothing terribly exciting, but we're going to build on this particular example. So what I want to do is I want to have 2 buttons below. So let's say button, and I want to say increase, and then I'm going to have another button, and I want to say decrease. So we go back here, we have our count, we have our 2 buttons that when I click increase, I want it to increment the number. When I click decrease, I want to decrement the number. So how can we do that? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create some methods that can handle this. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create a methods object. And inside this methods object, you can create any number of your own custom methods. So I'm going to create a method called increase, which is going to increase the count. So we can do this by saying this.increase, and we can just say plus plus. So that'll increment the increase the count by 1. Actually, I don't know why I did that. So that's this.count plus plus. And then we're going to create another method called decrease, and this.count minus minus. All right, so now we need a way to wire up our buttons to our methods. We need a way to say that when the user clicks on the button increase, we're going to call the method increase. And same for decrease. When you click the button decrease, we want to call the method decrease. And so the way that we do this in Vue is by using a directive. So we've seen directives before. We've used them to vbind. We have vif, vshow. We've seen it with v-for when we want to iterate over a collection of things. So we're going to use v-on directive. And what comes after the colon is the event that you want to listen for here. And in our case, we want to listen for the click event. Now, it can just take an expression in here. So if you wanted to, you could just come in here and say count plus plus. And if we go back to our view counter, that should work as is. But what I want to do is actually call the method increase because there may be other things that we need to do. And anytime you need to do something more than just a little evaluation or expression, you'll want to be able to call a method. So I wanted to show that example here. Now, we're going to do the same for decrease, but we're going to show the shorthand. So if you ever see this at symbol and then the event, that is just the shorthand for the v-on : click. And so in this case, we're going to call decrease. And if we go back to our application, we can increase and then we can decrease as well. So that's a little bit about event handling, but let's take this kind of one step further. So I do have some classes up here. I have a class for negative, which will give us a color red. And what I want to do is I want to display this class on the count. So anytime this goes into the negative, I want this to be red, like a danger. Hey, we're getting into negative number territory here. So one way that we can do this is by using a vbind on the class attribute. So if we say class here, again, this can take a property. So maybe we had a dynamic property of what we wanted this class to be. But it also has a special syntax where we can basically apply a class if an expression evaluates to true. And the way we do this is we have these angle brackets in here. And on the left is going to be the class name. So negative is the class name. And on the right is the expression. So what I'm going to say is if the count is less than 0, then I want you to apply this class to it. So let's go back over here. And as you can see, it's not red. If we start to increase it, everything's fine. But as soon as we go below 0, it's now applied that class to it. So if we jump in and look at the class, it is negative. And you can see as we increase, when it gets to 0, it takes that class off. So that's a little bit about dynamic class bindings and just something kind of cool you can do to add some more interactivity to your application. So I think that was it. I know this is a pretty simple example, but it really shows a couple of fundamental concepts. Being able to respond to events. There are a bunch of events that you can respond to. And in fact, let me jump over to the documentation real quick. If you go into the Learn and Guide section and go under Event Handling, this is where you want to go ahead and read through some more. Now that you've kind of gone through this tutorial, this would be a good section of the documentation to read to just to understand events a little bit more. So there are a lot of cool things that you can do with events. And like I said at the beginning, this is not only a fundamental concept of Vue, but really a fundamental component of building web applications in general. So I hope that you learned something new here. And with that, let's move on to the next lesson. In this lesson, you're going to create an application that displays the current time. While that alone doesn't sound that exciting, it gets pretty fun when you have to update that time every second. We're also going to take a look at another concept in Vue, which is called a lifecycle hook. Now to look at this a little bit further, we're going to jump into the documentation here. So we're at Vue.js.org. We're going to go over to Learn under Guide, and we're going to go under the Vue instance here and under lifecycle hooks. So we have instance lifecycle hooks, and then you have the diagram. So each Vue instance goes through a series of initialization steps when it's created. For example, it needs to set up data observation, compile the template, mount that instance to the DOM, and update the DOM when data changes. Along the way, it also runs functions called lifecycle hooks, giving users the opportunity to add their own code at specific stages. So here's the lifecycle diagram, and it says here you don't need to fully understand everything that's going on right now, but it is a useful reference. So I can tell you now, even after using Vue for a long time, that I haven't even used all of these lifecycle hooks, but it is good to know that they're there. And again, as it says, I always come back to this as a reference. So this is just showing you the progression of the Vue instance and all of the hooks that are available. So all of these in red here are the hooks that are available for you to hook into and basically run some code when those events happen. So things like created, before mount, mounted to the DOM, before something updates, as it's updated, before it's destroyed, and as it's destroyed. So we're going to take a look at a quick, simple example here of just kind of logging something out to the console when the application is mounted, or when the Vue instance is mounted. And that way we're going to use that as we start to build out this timer example. So let's head over to our code here, and we're going to go to timer, and we're going to go to start here. And so we have this new Vue instance, and the element is the ID of app. So this should look pretty familiar at this point. We've been doing this a lot. But what I want to do in here is go ahead and we'll go ahead and set up data. So data is a function that returns an object, and let's go ahead and let's just leave that empty for now. But what I want to do is, so at this point, we've normally set up our methods. So each of those method or lifecycle hooks, so mounted, before mount, before destroy, this is the name of the hook that we hook into. And to hook into it, we just use the name of that lifecycle hook as a function. So we just say mounted, and that is going to be a function. And now inside this mounted method, we can do whatever we want, and this will happen after the instance is mounted to the DOM. So let's just console log something out here. Vue instance was mounted, and we'll go ahead and run this. So let's go ahead and open this with live server, and we're going to go ahead and open our console because there's nothing happening here. And let's just refresh this, and you can see Vue instance was mounted. So there are other lifecycle hooks. If we wanted to use the created one, we just use the name as a method here. Oops. And we're just going to console.clg, and we're going to say created. And so if we go back, you now see that it's created, and then the Vue instance was mounted. So created happens first because that is the progression in which all of the lifecycle hooks happen. So they top down. So this before create is the first one that you can kind of hook into. Then it's create, then before mount, and then mounted. And that's why created happens first. So these lifecycle hooks give you the ability to really hook into the progression, the lifecycle of a Vue instance. And as you start to build out more complex examples, this is going to become very important. So we're going to get rid of created here. And I'm going to get rid of what's inside of here. And I want to start to build out our example. So I'm going to add some properties to our data object here. And I'm going to say message is hello view. And I'm also going to add a new one called now. So now is going to be the current time. And I'm just going to create a new date. So new date. So now that is going to be what the current time is when this loads. So if I come in here and I go H1 and we display our message, and then down below I display whatever now is. So if we come back to our example, it's going to say hello view, and here is the full date and time when it loads. So you see it's 10:30. If we go ahead and refresh it, it's 10:30:13. Refresh it again. That is updating. But what we want to do in our application is we don't want to have to refresh the page to update that current time. So how could we do that? So what I'm going to do in mounted is say, all right, we know that when the initial application loads, it displays the correct time. As soon as it's mounted, that time is correct. But once it's mounted, I need to somehow trigger an event that will allow us to refresh the current time. So the way that we can do that in JavaScript is by using setInterval. So setInterval is going to take a function here, and the second argument is going to be the delay that you want to run in. So I'm going to run in 1000 milliseconds, which is going to, oops, did I miss one here? Which is basically going to be equivalent to 1 second. So now what I want to do is I need to do something here. So every second I need to do something. So what I want to do is actually create a method. So we're going to come back up here. We're going to create that methods object. And we're going to create a new method in here called update date. And what we're going to do is we're going to set now. So here's our property now. So we're inside of that instance. We're going to refer to it with this dot now is equal to new date. So all we do now is we call the update. Oh, we're going to need to refer to this update date. And now every second it's going to call a method called update date. And in update date, we just update the variable, the property called now, to the new current date, which is really the date time. So if we go back to our application, you'll see it running, but now it's updating every single time. And if we want to see that in action, we can actually just log something out here. Updating date time. And if we look in the console now, you'll see every second, you'll see the little number here populating. So it's just calling that function over and over again. And again, we were able to do that because we know that, hey, once the page or once the component, the Vue instance is mounted, this lifecycle hook will run. And now that gives us an opportunity at that point to create that set interval that's going to run every 1 second. So again, trivial example, but you can see we're starting to use all of these different concepts to start building out some pretty exciting functionality. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to take everything that we've kind of learned so far. And in the next lesson, we're going to go ahead and update this to actually create a Vue component that we can then reuse multiple times on a single web page or across our application. So we'll do that in the next lesson. Now that we've had a chance to cover the basic concepts in Vue, I want to talk about components. The idea of creating reusable components is something you will see a lot of in different JavaScript frameworks out there. Take our timer application that we just built as an example. That was a cool application, but I wouldn't want to rewrite that each time I wanted to use it on a web page or within an application. What I want is a way to package that up into a component that is reusable, that I could use multiple times on a page or multiple times within the same application. Vue components give us that ability. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take what we finished with in the timer example, and we're going to create a reusable component that can be used multiple times on a page or in an application. And then we can also tweak it to make it a little bit customizable. So if we wanted it one way on one page and a different way on another, we can totally do that. So again, here is the finished application. Now, the first difference that you're going to notice here is that we are going to package this up in a JavaScript file. So here I have a components directory, and in the components directory, I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to call this dansclock.js. Now, the first thing that we need to do to create a new component is to use Vue and use a method called component. So we're going to say Vue.component, and then this is going to take a couple arguments. The first one is the name of the component. So I'm going to say Dan's clock, and then it's going to take an object, which is kind of like the Vue instance, right? Remember when we say something like new Vue, it is a method that takes an object, and inside of that object is a bunch of options, right? And so this is no different. So this is where all of the different options go. So now we don't need to rewrite all of this. We can come back in here and let's grab the data, the methods, and the mounted. So that's here. We're just going to paste this in here. So a lot of the logic is the same when we're creating a component. The only thing a little bit different is we need a way to create a template. So when we're on a page, when we're on this page here, we mount it to this ID of app here, and that ID is the template. Anything inside of there is now kind of how we output properties and listen for interactivity and that kind of thing. So we need to do that within the Vue component. We need to actually create that template. And you can use the template property. And now this needs to be a string. So if you were going to use like a multi-line string, you might want to use backticks. So what I want to do is actually create a div with a class of clock. And inside of that div, I'm just going to display now. So this is when we use this particular component, Dan's clock, this is the template that is going to be rendered to the DOM, right? So nothing else changes. Everything right now looks exactly like we want it to look like. So if we go ahead and save this, what I need to do now on, let's go into start. So we're in Vue component start. So what I need to do now is actually import that component. So I'm just going to have a script tag here that is going to look in components and look for Dan's clock.js. So now that that's in here, we still have to say, hey, Vue, this is where I want you to operate, because if we go ahead and add this component to the page without creating an instance, a new instance of Vue, then nothing will work. Okay, so now I'm just going to go ahead and say Dan's clock, because that is the name of the component. Remember, if we go back over here, this is the name that we gave our component. So I can just add it like a HTML element, whether it's like a paragraph tag or an href. But we've created a custom component called Dan's clock that I can now add to this page. So if I go ahead and save this, and you will see that it's outputting the current time and it's updating every second. So now if we go back here, that entirely by itself is not that cool. But now what we can do is actually add multiple instances, and you'll see that they're all kind of working on their own. So that's pretty cool. We've created a reusable component that can be used multiple times on a page or within an application. Now let's take this one step further. Let's say that we have two instances here, and we want one instance to maybe just be a little bit shorter of a format and just like display just the time. So what we can do is we can go back into our component here, and components can accept something called props. And props are a way to pass data into our component that we could then use to maybe customize the component. So I'm going to say props, and this props can be declared in multiple ways. You can look in the documentation if you want to see all the kind of nuances to props. There is a lot there. You can get really granular with defining what type of data that prop is, what default data it's going to be. But an easy way to get props set up is to just create an array of the different properties you expect to be passed in. So the first one I expect is something called format. And all I'm going to do is, just to keep this very simple, I'm going to say that if you pass in the format of short, that we're going to display something a little bit different, else we're just going to display it as it's been displayed. So the way that I'm going to do that here is I'm going to create a const called d, just short for date. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if this dot format is equal to short, I want you to go ahead and display as new date to local time string, which just cuts it down, like I said, to just the time. Else, I want you to use the value of new date, which we've been using, which will just be that long format. And then you can say this dot now is equal to d. So now I'm going to go back over to my start. I'm going to leave the first one the same. And now, as an attribute to this component, I can say format is equal to short. So let's save that, head back to the browser, and now you can see this first one displayed as is, but this second one is displaying just the time, just that short format that we wanted to be able to display. So that's really cool. That is creating reusable components, and then through something called props, we can go ahead and start to customize each instance of the component. So you could even take that one step further if you wanted to, and you could maybe set a starting time. Maybe you wanted to set a time and maybe count backwards or whatever. You could see where I'm going with this. One thing else I do want to mention is as you start to build out components, you're going to see examples of components around the internet that look something like this. So if you look in the final component folder, there's a danceclock.vue. So we know that Vue is not really an extension, right? Vue is what we know as a single file component. And what this is everything that a component would need wrapped up into one. You have your markup here, which is in your template section. You have your JavaScript, which is in your script section. And then you have your CSS, which is in your style section. And this gets really fun because this is the way that we can build components in one, where I have everything related to this component wrapped up in a single file. That's why they call them single file components. Now to create these, you can't just do this. You could, but it'd take a lot of wiring things up. But when you start to get into creating Vue applications using something called the Vue CLI, which will kickstart your applications, these are the type of components you will be creating. But I don't want you to worry about having to create those now. I just wanted you to be aware of them so that as you start to search for components around the web, you're probably going to see components that look like this. And I just wanted you to understand where that was coming from. So I think that's it for this lesson. I hope you really found the power in being able to take that component that we created earlier and make it a reusable component that can be now used multiple times in a page or our application. And this is the real power of Vue and other JavaScript frameworks, is being able to create these reusable components and then compose our applications of components and other components. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson. I just wanted to take a minute and thank you for taking this course with me. I know your time is valuable and I appreciate you spending a little bit of it with me. I really hope you found this course valuable, but either way, it would really help me out if you left a review and shared your experiences with other potential students. If you have any questions, please ask them here or reach out to me directly.